One time I sneezed so hard I shit my pants.
That is a whole new story!
Okay, look, I got a bit of a crush on spectacle fighters. It's no secret I've been kicking sandcastles, and while I could sing its praises, I want to address some shortcomings. Short campaigns, lacking story either through pacing or general coherence, and combat having complexity that asks for a time investment most wouldn't commit to. However, from what I've seen, almost everyone seems to love Hi-Fi Rush as much as I do, which is pretty surprising to see. Because in all honesty, when a spectacle fighter does well, like really well, it's almost never for combat. Don't get me wrong, quality in a game's combat is as important as any other aspect, but what I've noticed, the more I indulge in the sweet nectar that is spectacle fighters, is that most players only care about combat up to a certain extent. Most players can appreciate a game with fun combat, but rarely will they put time into knowing why it's fun, and that's perfectly understandable. I'm not trying to make a case of Salem witch hunting players who play a game once and don't take a PhD in a game's combat system. Like, a good chunk of people struggle to even finish games. You think people that picked up MGR after seeing it on their favorite gimmick Twitter account know what dodge offset is? Now, I'm not going to act like Hi-Fi doesn't have other redeeming factors past its combat. It does. From the second you say go, Hi-Fi bombards the player with a colourful world, lovable characters, and a banging soundtrack, both licensed and original. Point is, when a game such as Hi-Fi Rush comes along and takes the spectacle fighter genre, a genre that Hideki Kamiya, a pioneer of the genre, describes as the first playthrough being a tutorial, then add an additional execution barrier of rhythm games, I think I get why they shadow dropped it. Now, while Hi-Fi has received a great amount of praise, one thing I think doesn't get enough praise is how well the rhythm and spectacle fighter elements mesh. In Hi-Fi Rush, the rhythm takes an omnipresent aura, beating the heart of the world you inhabit. Rhythm is a template, not a cookie cutter, to put it bluntly. You, the world, and even the HUD are animated to the beat, meaning should you need a quick pointer to get back into rhythm, you wouldn't need to look far. Rhythm also controls the flow of combat, as all incoming attacks will telegraph and land on beat, which helps alleviate the initial challenge of attempting to stay on beat, since enemies are playing by the same rules. The spectacle fighter side of Hi-Fi Rush shows a lot of Platinum Games influence, as to begin with, Chai attacks in strings rather than individual moves comprised of light and heavy attacks. The strings themselves hold a lot of variety, featuring delay strings and air strings with each containing various properties, besides just looking different. Where the effects of them are fully realized is with the beat hit, Hi-Fi's string ender. As you perform the final attack of a string, a ring will appear on screen, which, if successful, will perform a special attack depending on the string. Landing a beat hit makes enemies drop batteries, which fill your reverb meter. Individually, these mechanics might not seem like much, however the beauty of Hi-Fi's combat system is how much they coexist and combine in gameplay. To start, matching your hits to the beat gives you a bonus damage and technically higher attack speed. The reason I say technically is because regardless of when you make an attack input, said attack will always land on beat. This alone makes finding the beat even easier, as you don't even need to look away from what you're fighting, because throwing an attack will instantly get you back into the rhythm. You also have a dash and a parry, which, while at first might seem self-explanatory, like the mechanics I previously mentioned, they are enhanced by staying on beat. The dash can be chained to cover more distance and pull in items from further away, but if you're feeling risky, parry rewards stricter timing with greater benefits, such as bonus stun damage and score points, as well as brief invincibility if you throw in a directional input relative to the damage. And if that wasn't enough, something I haven't seen anyone talk about, nor does the game tell you, is that you can parry the barrier summoning animation of the blue enemies to instantly break their barrier. If a dodge or parry is performed with just timing, you can follow up with a counter. Steel counter lets you grab an enemy and launch them into the air, but where counters really shine is with your partners. Over the course of the campaign, you'll be introduced to partners that can offer assistance in traversal and combat. When summoned on their own, they will perform an attack, with each partner specializing with certain enemies. However, if summoned as a counter, they'll perform a more powerful version of their regular attack. On top of this, each partner has a hold attack, which has some form of crowd control, such as as root or penetrate. As such, if you're looking to break any barriers or shields, you would be wise to summon a partner either with a hold or counter attack, as it will save you time. But if you ask me, all this pales in comparison to jam combos. As the countdown for a beat hit begins, summoning a partner instead will perform a jam combo. Jam combos cost 1 bar of meter and will make the cooldown for the respective partner longer, but it is absolutely worth it. You get more damage, more stun, they look sick, and make combos super easy. They also net you a nifty score bonus, so if you're struggling with those S ranks, maybe give those a shot. But if you're feeling a little antisocial, you might enjoy spending your meter on special attacks. Special attacks are super moves that can offer a good amount of customization to your playstyle, as not all of them are screen-wide attacks. There's a launcher, a heal, a stun, with each costing differing amounts of reverb meter, meaning if you want the stronger ones, you'll have to keep an eye out for those upgrades. All of these mechanics culminate together to make a delicious full-course meal where the synergy of rhythm and combat both help educate and incentivize mastery. While in the beginning you might struggle in fights, just knowing that damage can only be done on beat gives you a good time frame on when to expect incoming damage. Whereas if you're on the opposite end, having trouble staying in rhythm, it is possible to brute force it by reacting to enemy startup animations, since a lot of enemies will telegraph the amount of hits in their attacks. Oddly enough, my learning process for Hi-Fi's combat overall was smooth for the most part, as I had played a game with a remarkably similar concept, albeit minus the focus on rhythm. Oni-chan Origins. Now hold on, clear your eyes shrouded by hate as this game's brave character design. To get straight to the point, this game has a mechanic called Call Combinations, in which your attacks gain additional properties if you time your inputs, specifically as your attack lands. I had no analysis past that. I just find it funny that playing Oni-chan of all things prepared me for playing Hi-Fi Rush. So, what poor punching bags are you going to be seeing in combo mads to come? Well, when it comes to non-boss enemies, the roster is entirely composed of robotic enemies, bursting at the brims with personality, while also continuing the game's impressively self-imposed rule of animating everything to the beat. And if that wasn't enough, all but 1 or 2 of these enemies outright have a light flashing on their torso blinking to the beat. As you start out, fights will consist of lesser enemies that don't have much health and can be launched whenever you want, but as you progress you'll come across tougher enemies in which you must fill up their stun gauge before they'll be affected by your CC. Now, I'll admit, I was worried when I noticed color-coded enemies alongside the partners, as I thought this was another Solstice scenario, where it acts as a roadblock to the combat rather than an enhancement of it. Luckily, it's the opposite. In fact, the way the game presents the solution to combat roadblocks like shields and barriers is actually the most inefficient way, as you're initially taught to just summon them. Barriers alone can be negated by parrying the activation animation. Same goes for shields, as some enemies only have front-facing shields, meaning you can just ignore them entirely by approaching them from behind. And when it comes to fire enemies, they tend to be more aggressive, so they stay on fire, making it easier to punish them with parries to get combos going. When it comes to bosses, Hi-Fi offers a very good roster, while each being more visually impressive than the last, while keeping the mechanical consistency regular enemies introduced, with there being some exceptions. Starting with QA1 Million, QA1 Million is a good starter boss. That's a punching bag, more so to teach you the boss format, as the health bar illustrates their phases. With that being said, they do have some good moves that teach you to use certain mechanics that otherwise make you take damage, such as the electrical burst attack that covers a majority of the stage. Another exception is Roguefur. Now, I know a lot of people like this one, but I noticed that Hi-Fi's mechanics don't really complement larger bosses, and Roguefur is a perfect example of this. QA1 Million worked because they were simple and didn't move a lot, which makes them a good introductory boss, which is a pretty consistent theme in spectacle fighters, examples being Goliath and Beloved. They're simple enough that new players don't have to learn too much, and experienced players get a nice big stress ball to style on. But Roguefur, I imagine due to his large stature, doesn't have a stun gauge, so you only land a couple attacks before he is on the move again, and he moves a lot, and that's just his wolf form. In his human form, it's even worse. He just doesn't stop running. And the final exception, okay, look, I get it. You lot are gassed about Corsica, but her boss fight is just about parrying. And I don't mean as in like a skill check, like literally her fight has you do as Simon says. But other than them, the rest of the bosses are much more consistent, having a stun gauge similar to tough enemies, with the main difference being that they are only stunned for a limited time, and if they're launched and touch the ground, they break out of stun, which alone keeps them consistent while having their own individuality when it comes to their style and movesets. So, on the whole, it's a pretty good roster without any I'd classify as super annoying or outright bad. Outside of combat, traversal is mostly par for the course, with light platforming alongside your partners to complete basic puzzles. During this, it's pretty common for your crew to talk, and I found myself really enjoying these sequences as their discussions would help to expand on these characters and develop their relationships. Where some characters might start by arguing with each other, over the course of the game, they will start opening up and developing. Now as you get closer and closer to the end of the game, it has less room to develop the characters that are introduced later, as they would naturally have less screen time, but Hi-Fi does a wonderful job of giving each character that joins you a convincing motivation to help. On top of that, as I've noticed a few people pointing out that Hi-Fi is rated 12, because the conversation of kids media appealing to an older generation is usually tied to shows, and games more so being a point of nostalgia, but with Hi-Fi, it just feels like a fun game that just so happens to be suitable for kids. Call me biased, but I would have loved to have played this when I was a kid. All in all, Hi-Fi Rush is excellent, as you've probably already heard, but the idea of combining spectacle fighting and rhythm is executed so well that I wonder why it hasn't happened already, as it feels so natural. The mechanics introduced feel so fun to utilize in combat, where they previously felt like a grievance to interrupt the flow of combat in a poor attempt to stand out in other games. Past that, the story is fun, graphically oozing style, and a wonderful selection of music. Seeing a spectacle fighter be a full package is rare, but fortunately more common these days, as I experienced no bugs throughout my several playthroughs of Hi-Fi's amazing campaign. Should you get bored though, there are also Spectrum missions, which do a wonderful job of teaching you the game's deeper mechanics, as well as Rhythm Tower, in which you fight waves of enemies while attempting to beat the clock, with the cherry on top being that you can also customize the look of your characters, some outfits of which only being unlockable by completing the game on various difficulties and beating the Rhythm Tower. In fact, just recently there was another update introducing 2 new game modes, BPM Rush and Power Up, both being a unique spin on the Bloody Palace format you'd be used to. BPM Rush has you fight a gauntlet of enemies, with each new wave increasing the BPM, and therefore the speed of the game. Power Up on the other hand effectively turns Hi-Fi into a roguelite, resetting your stats and abilities, which you build back up throughout your run. Completing the assigned challenges for these 2 game modes nets you various rewards, the final of which sends you to an abandoned room. This room has a wealth of messages from the developers, as well as probably the best skin in the game. To be honest, Hi-Fi Rush just feels nice. There wasn't a single moment playing this game where I didn't feel like the developers love and care throughout. I know I rag on games for not having super deep combat, but honestly, it's been so nice seeing spectacle fighters get the attention I feel it was lacking recently. Don't get me wrong, I love to bring up DMC5 every chance I can, but let's be honest, something like that is only coming out every decade. So having games like Solstice, Hi-Fi Rush, and FF16s come out that respect the game genre, while also making it a game that most can enjoy, is something I'm really happy to see.